Richard Lopez's weathered hands trembled as he stared at the bank statement, the crisp paper now crumpled at the edges from his tightening grip. Offshore account transfers, in his wife's handwriting but never discussed with him. 43 years of marriage, and now this. A single tear escaped, landing on the statement where Aaliyah's signature mocked him. The grandfather clock's steady ticking, once comforting in their shared study, now hammered each second of his unraveling life. Coffee cooled, forgotten beside him, its aroma mixing with the salt of silent tears. Has betrayal ever blindsided you after decades of trust? Share your story below, like if Richard's pain resonates. Follow to discover if experience and wisdom can triumph over deception. He traced their wedding photo with a shaking finger, remembering their retirement plans, now appearing as hollow as the promises behind them. Outside, thunder rumbled, a perfect accompaniment to the storm brewing within as he reached for his reading glasses, financial expert instincts awakening. Richard Lopez's weathered fingers traced the bank statement's columns, stopping abruptly at the unfamiliar transfer. 43 years in financial analysis hadn't prepared him for discovering discrepancies in his own accounts. Not these accounts, not with Aaliyah's signature authorizing transactions he'd never discussed. The evening light filtering through his study's half-drawn curtains cast long shadows across his mahogany desk, illuminating dust motes that danced in the silence. His leather chair creaked as he leaned forward, the sound amplified in the empty house that once echoed with family laughter. Not possible. Not after all these years. His vision blurred as the first tear formed. The grandfather clock in the corner, an anniversary gift from decades past, ticked relentlessly, marking the seconds of his unraveling certainty. He remembered Aaliyah's explanation just last week about their retirement investments, her confident smile as she outlined their financial future, a future they'd built together, documented in the family photographs, watching him from every wall. The tear fell, landing on the offshore account number, a string of digits that shouldn't exist. His breath caught, a small sob escaping before he could control it. His hand instinctively reached for the framed photo of their last family gathering, fingers trembling as they touched the glass over Aaliyah's face. Richard's shoulders slumped forward as another sob broke free. The coffee in his monogrammed mug, "World's Best Husband," embossed in fading gold, had grown cold, its aroma mixing with the salt of silent tears. He'd prided himself on managing other people's money with impeccable precision for decades. How had he missed this betrayal in his own home? The dates aligned perfectly with Aaliyah's business trips to the Caribbean. His financial analyst's mind began connecting patterns even as his heart splintered. This wasn't a mistake or oversight. The transactions showed deliberate planning over months. He wiped his eyes with the handkerchief Aaliyah had given him for their 40th anniversary, now a painful irony. As his vision cleared, he noticed something his tears had nearly obscured. A smudge on Aaliyah's signature, different from her usual precise penmanship. Decades of analyzing financial documents had trained his eye to spot inconsistencies others might miss. Could there be more? His spine straightened slightly as professional instincts began overriding emotional devastation. The retirement they'd planned, the legacy for their children, the security he'd spent a lifetime building, all potentially compromised. He pulled open his desk drawer, reaching for his reading glasses with newfound purpose. A soft knock at the front door interrupted his thoughts. Richard froze, glancing at his watch. Aaliyah wasn't due home for hours. She'd texted about a late meeting. His heartbeat quickened as he carefully folded the statement. Friend or foe standing outside. And how much did they know? Richard dried his eyes with determined finality, tucking the handkerchief away with a precision that belied his inner turmoil. The knocking ceased, probably a package delivery. He turned back to the statement, his financial analyst's discipline reasserting itself through decades of muscle memory. He reached for the phone, fingers hesitating over his longtime colleague Martin's number. Martin had worked alongside him at the firm for 30 years before their joint retirement. If anyone could offer discreet insight, it would be him. "Richard, how's retirement treating you?" Martin's voice boomed with forced cheer. "Fine, just fine." Richard's voice betrayed nothing, a skill honed through countless high-stakes negotiations. "Quick question about offshore structures, hypothetically speaking." The pause on the line stretched a beat too long. "Any particular reason for the interest?" Richard's grip tightened on the receiver. "Just reviewing some investment options." He kept his tone casual while watching his knuckles whiten. "Perhaps this isn't the best time." Martin's voice had cooled noticeably. "Aaliyah mentioned you've been preoccupied lately." Richard's heart stuttered. Aaliyah had spoken to Martin. About him. "I'll call another time," he managed, ending the call before emotion could overtake him again. His office darkened as evening deepened, the rain now pattering against the windows in a rhythm that matched his quickening pulse. He swiveled his chair away from the family photos that suddenly felt like strangers watching him. A new wave of tears threatened, but anger pushed them back. They all knew. "They've been talking behind my back." Richard moved to his filing cabinet with newfound purpose, the familiar action centering him. The metal drawer slid open with a satisfying precision that contrasted with his unraveling personal life. Inside, meticulously labeled folders contained years of financial records, his backup system despite Aaliyah's teasing about his old-fashioned ways. Thank God for old habits. He spread previous statements across his desk, creating a timeline with the methodical approach that had earned him industry respect. The pattern emerged with sickening clarity. Small transfers at first, growing bolder over 6 months, all coinciding with Aaliyah's increased travel schedule. His finger traced the first unusual transaction, dated exactly 1 week after their conversation about retirement timing. The conversation where he'd suggested waiting another year, while she'd pushed for immediate plans. Richard's reflection in the darkened window startled him. A man he barely recognized, eyes hollowed by betrayal. He turned away, unable to face even himself as shame burned through him. How had he missed this? Him, of all people. The desk drawer stuck slightly as he pulled it open further, revealing a stack of mail he'd set aside earlier. On top sat a business card that made his blood freeze. Jacobson Meyer, divorce attorneys. The edge worn as if frequently handled. Rain pounded harder against the glass as Richard's professional detachment finally crumbled. A single bitter tear escaped before he wiped it away with resolute finality. Tears wouldn't fix this, but decades of financial expertise might. His mind was already calculating his next move when the text alert sounded. Aaliyah, announcing she'd be staying overnight for an emergency client meeting. Richard's jaw set as he began making notes on his legal pad. This wasn't just about money anymore. Richard rose stiffly from his desk, joints protesting after hours hunched over financial statements. The storm outside had intensified, thunder punctuating his darkening thoughts. He moved deliberately toward the family portrait hanging slightly askew on the wall, the one Aaliyah had straightened just yesterday. Odd that she'd noticed that, but not me noticing her. Behind the portrait lay their home safe, installed when they'd first moved in, when the children were small and dreams were shared. His fingers hesitated on the combination dial, momentarily drawing a blank before muscle memory took over, their wedding date, followed by the children's birth years. The metal door swung open with a whisper of well-oiled hinges. Inside lay their most important documents, property deeds, insurance policies, wills drafted together until death do us part. He reached past their passports, Aaliyah's conspicuously newer than it should be, for the folder containing their financial power of attorney documents. Empty. Richard's breath caught. Those papers gave complete financial control to the surviving spouse. Papers, now mysteriously missing. She's been planning this, he whispered to the silent room, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. The safe's cold metal reflected his face, distorted and tear-streaked. He methodically checked each folder, finding other critical documents missing. Their prenuptial agreement modification from 10 years ago, property transfer papers for their vacation home, documents only a financial professional would recognize as important. The grandfather clock chimed 11, each resonant tone another year of their marriage dissolving into betrayal. Richard closed the safe with deliberate care, replacing the portrait with hands that no longer trembled. Emotion was giving way to something colder, more focused. He returned to his desk, unlocking the bottom drawer where he kept a backup of essential documents. Another old-fashioned habit Aaliyah had teased him about. His caution now seemed prescient, rather than paranoid. The copies were intact, including records of the vacation property Aaliyah had suggested putting solely in her name for tax purposes last year, a suggestion he'd resisted, insisting on joint ownership despite her unusual persistence. She's been laying groundwork for months. His phone vibrated with another text. Aaliyah confirming her business trip would extend through tomorrow, the same trip she'd initially described as just a day meeting. Richard pulled up their shared calendar on his tablet, meticulously cross-referencing her trips against the suspicious transactions. Perfect alignment. Too perfect. Outside, lightning illuminated the garden where they'd renewed their vows on their 30th anniversary. The memory of her tearful promises now tasted bitter as ash. Thunder followed, rattling the windows like his faith in their shared history. He looked down at his wedding band, golden and worn with decades of commitment. For the first time since placing it on his finger, he twisted it. Not off, but loose. A physical acknowledgement of emotional distance. Richard gathered the evidence into a leather portfolio, another anniversary gift from Aaliyah, ironically perfect for containing proof of her deception. His reflection in the window showed a different man than hours before. Posture straightened, jaw set, eyes clear despite their redness. A soft sound from the front of the house caught his attention, a car door closing, too early for Aaliyah's return. He moved to the window, peering through rain-streaked glass to glimpse a figure hurrying up the walkway. The porch light illuminated a familiar face, their daughter Elena, unexpected and unannounced. The child who had always been closest to her mother. Richard tucked the portfolio into his desk drawer, locked it, and pocketed the key. The game had changed. Was Elena here as ally or unwitting spy? He straightened his shoulders, wiped the last evidence of tears from his face, and moved to answer the door. Morning light found Richard at his desk, eyes reddened from a sleepless night, but mind crystalline with purpose. Elena's visit had been brief, ostensibly to borrow a book, but peppered with casual questions about his plans, his health, whether he was handling retirement okay. Her eyes, so like her mother's, had darted around his office, lingering on the financial statements he'd hastily covered. "Dad, Mom's worried about you," she'd said at the door. "Says you've been obsessing over the accounts lately." Richard had smiled, patted her hand. "Just keeping busy, sweetheart." Now, alone again, he methodically arranged his evidence in chronological order. The portfolio contained bank statements, travel records, annotated calendar printouts, and photocopies of the missing documents. His investigative headquarters was taking shape, transforming grief into action. He checked his watch. 8:30 a.m. Banks would be open. He dressed with careful attention, selecting his charcoal suit, power tie, polished shoes, armor for battle. The drive to First National Bank felt surreal, passing landmarks of their shared life. The restaurant where they'd celebrated anniversaries, the park where they'd pushed grandchildren on swings. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as he passed Aaliyah's favorite jewelry store, where purchases had apparently been made without his knowledge, according to credit card statements. At a stoplight, a tear of anger threatened. He blinked it away, refusing to give it passage. Not now. Not yet. The bank manager, David Chen, greeted him warmly. "Mr. Lopez. Rare to see you without Mrs. Lopez these days." Richard maintained his professional smile. "Handling some personal matters, David. I'd like to review all account access histories for our joint holdings." Something in his tone made David's smile fade slightly. "Of course. Though, Mrs. Lopez was just in last week requesting similar information." Richard's heart stuttered, but his expression remained unchanged. "Was she? How thorough of her. Nevertheless, I'd like to see everything." An hour later, he sat in his car, hands trembling with suppressed rage as he reviewed the documents. Aaliyah had accessed their safety deposit box repeatedly over the past 3 months. A box containing family jewelry and bearer bonds he'd purchased years ago. The digital access logs showed systematic visits each time he'd been at his weekly golf game. "Planning. Always planning," he whispered, voice rough with emotion. His next stop was their investment firm, where his former protégée, Jessica, now managed their retirement portfolio. Her discomfort was palpable as she pulled up their records. "There have been requests for liquidity options," she admitted after his pointed questions. Mrs. Lopez was exploring penalties for early withdrawals. "When?" Richard's voice was dangerously quiet. "The first inquiry was about 6 months ago. Richard, I assumed you were aware." "Assumptions are dangerous in finance, Jessica. We taught you better." Driving home, the full scope of Aaliyah's betrayal crystallized like a malignant growth. Financial extraction, document removal, alliance building with friends and family, classic high net worth divorce preparation. He'd seen clients go through similar situations, never imagining he'd become the target. Back in his study, Richard pinned a map to his corkboard, marking locations of offshore banks corresponding to the transfer destinations. His rage transformed into cold, methodical focus, the same mental state that had made him legendary in forensic accounting circles. A package delivery arrived mid-afternoon. Richard hadn't ordered anything but signed anyway. Inside, an envelope contained hotel receipts for the Royal Palms Resort, charges from dates when Aaliyah claimed to be at business conferences in Chicago. Attached was a note. "Thought you should know. A concerned friend." The receipts showed room service for 2. Wine preferences he knew weren't Aaliyah's. The sob that escaped him was raw, primal. Nothing like the quiet tears of yesterday. His body shook with it, a physical manifestation of betrayal so complete it seemed to rewrite their history. When it passed, Richard wiped his face and reached for his phone, not for emotional support, but for strategic alliance. His finger hovered over an unfamiliar number he'd discovered in Aaliyah's deleted browser history. Private investigator Michael Torres. Why had Aaliyah been researching him? Or was she being investigated by him? Either way, he might hold answers. As Richard dialed, his wedding photo stared accusingly from the desk. He turned it face down with finality. "Mr. Torres, my name is Richard Lopez. I believe we might have a mutual interest in my wife's activities." "I'm afraid I can't discuss my clients, Mr. Lopez," Michael Torres said, his voice professionally detached over the phone. "Not asking you to," Richard replied, matching the investigator's tone, "simply suggesting a conversation that might benefit us both." A lengthy pause. "Cafe Meridian, tomorrow, 10 a.m. Come alone." Richard set down his phone, momentarily buoyed by this potential lead. The feeling evaporated when his phone chimed with a text from his son James. "Rain check on dinner tomorrow? Swamped at work." The 3rd cancellation this month. Richard stared at the message, the pattern now painfully obvious. His children were avoiding him, likely coached by Aaliyah that something was wrong with their father. He texted back a casual, "No problem, son. while his heart constricted. Richard's lawyer, Patricia Winters, welcomed him into her office that afternoon, her expression grave as she reviewed his evidence. "This is concerning, Richard," she said, tapping manicured nails on the offshore account statements. "But proving malicious intent versus poor communication between spouses can be challenging." "We've been married 43 years, Richard said, voice tight. "There is no poor communication explanation for hidden accounts." Patricia's eyes softened with pity, a look he'd come to hate. "Aaliyah's position as CEO gives her significant resources. Her legal team will claim these are legitimate business accounts you misunderstood. And the missing documents? The hotel receipts? Circumstantial without context." She leaned forward. "Richard, you need something definitive, a smoking gun. Otherwise, this becomes your word against hers." He left the office feeling hollowed out. The crisp spring day mocked his darkening mood as he walked through the park where he and Aaliyah had once brought their children. Elderly couples sat on benches, holding hands, sharing newspapers, images of a future now shattered for him. Richard settled heavily on an empty bench, watching children play while parents chatted nearby. One mother glanced his way, then hurriedly gathered her child closer, a solitary older man apparently suspect by default. Loneliness crashed over him with physical force. 43 years of partnership had integrated Aaliyah into every aspect of his life. Their friends were shared friends. Their social circles overlapped completely. Even his golf partners were husbands of her book club members. How strategically convenient for her now. His phone rang. Elena again. "Dad, Mom's really worried. She says you've been acting paranoid, checking accounts, visiting the bank. James and I think maybe you should talk to someone." Richard's grip tightened on the phone. "Did your mother mention she's been transferring funds offshore without my knowledge?" Silence, then softly. "Dad, Mom said you might say something like this. She warned us your memory has been concerning lately." The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. "My memory. The doctor said early signs can include paranoia, especially about money. Mom's just trying to protect you. And us." Richard's voice failed him entirely. His brilliant, accomplished daughter, the child who'd inherited his analytical mind, believed he was declining mentally. Worse, she'd been convinced by Aaliyah's manipulation. "I have to go," he managed finally. "Dad, please." He ended the call, slumping forward as the first tears of despair broke free. Not the shocked tears of discovery or the angry tears of betrayal, but hopeless, body-racking sobs that he couldn't control. The park blurred around him, his portfolio clutched uselessly to his chest. A young mother on a nearby bench gathered her child and moved away, casting concerned glances back at the elderly man falling apart in public. Has the pain of betrayal ever left you sobbing alone, surrounded by evidence no one believes? Share your darkest moment below. Like if Richard's pain mirrors yours, follow to see if wisdom and experience can still triumph over deception. Richard finally composed himself enough to return to his car, only to find a parking ticket. The meter had expired during his breakdown. One more petty indignity in a collapsing world. At home, the silent house felt like a mausoleum to his former life. He spread his evidence across the kitchen table, staring at it through reddened eyes. All his expertise, all his careful documentation, worthless if everyone believed he was losing his mind. His phone chimed with an email notification from an unfamiliar address, sandra.martinez@meridian.com. "Mr. Lopez, we haven't met, but I have information about your wife you need to see. I'll be at Cafe Meridian tomorrow with Michael. Please come alone. Aaliyah can never know about this contact." Richard stared at the message, hope flickering weakly through despair. Who was Sandra Martinez? And what did she know about Aaliyah? He sat alone at the kitchen table where countless family meals had been shared. tracing the wood grain with his finger. Outside, rain began to fall again, matching the tear that slid down his weathered cheek. For the first time, Richard wondered if fighting was worth it. Perhaps at 65, it was simply too late to start over. The thought had barely formed when his hand closed around the evidence folder with renewed determination. He hadn't spent a lifetime building security for his family only to watch it stolen through manipulation. Tomorrow would bring new information. Tonight, he would prepare. Cafe Meridian hummed with mid-morning activity, the clink of cups and murmur of conversations providing perfect cover for sensitive discussions. Richard arrived early, selecting a corner table with clear sight lines to both the entrance and emergency exit, a precaution that felt necessary rather than paranoid now. He recognized Michael Torres immediately from the website photo. Mid-30s, military posture, observant eyes scanning the room. Beside him walked a striking young woman whose nervous energy manifested in constant adjustments to her jewelry, twisting rings, touching earrings. Sandra Martinez, presumably. Richard stood as they approached, noting how Sandra flinched slightly at the movement. "Mr. Lopez." Torres extended his hand. "Thank you for coming." "Seems we have mutual interests," Richard replied, his analytical mind already cataloging details. Torres's protective positioning beside Sandra, her expensive but conservative attire, the way her eyes darted to the door repeatedly. "I'm Sandra," she said once they were seated, voice barely above a whisper. "I've been involved with your wife for the past 8 months. Despite suspecting as much from the hotel receipts, hearing it confirmed sent a fresh wave of pain through Richard's chest. He maintained his composed expression, decades of professional negotiation serving him well. "I see. It's not what you think," Sandra continued, hands trembling around her coffee cup. "At least, not entirely. I was Aaliyah's executive assistant at Lopez Enterprises before we became close." Richard's mind raced. Aaliyah had never mentioned hiring a new assistant named Sandra. Ms. Martinez was hired under a different name, Torres explained, reading Richard's confusion. "One of several red flags I discovered while investigating her for a different client." "Your former fiancé," Richard concluded, connecting dots with practiced efficiency. Sandra's eyes widened. "How did you—" "I make connections for a living, Ms. Martinez, or did before retirement." Richard turned to Torres. "You were hired to investigate Sandra, not Aaliyah, but you found my wife instead." Torres nodded. "Sandra's ex-fiancé hired me after she suddenly broke their engagement. I tracked a pattern of expensive gifts, mysterious income, secret meetings, all leading to Aaliyah Lopez. She promised me everything," Sandra said, eyes downcast. "A future together, once she was free from her marriage constraints." Richard absorbed this with outward calm, though his heart hammered painfully. "And the offshore accounts?" Sandra reached into her purse, extracting a USB drive. "Everything's here. Account numbers, passwords, transfer records. Aaliyah set these up through shell companies over the past year, moving nearly $150 million. Richard's financial expertise calculated the figure instantly, approximately half their net worth. "There's more," Torres added. "The Mistress narrative was deliberate misdirection." "I don't understand," Richard said. Sandra's composure cracked slightly. "Aaliyah needed someone to take the fall if her financial maneuvers were discovered. Our relationship was real for me, but for her, it was strategic. She's been recording our conversations, planting evidence suggesting I manipulated her into the transfers. Making you the villain if anything went wrong," Richard concluded, professional admiration for the scheme mixing with personal devastation. "I discovered her true plan last week," Sandra continued. "She's not planning to leave with me. Once the divorce is finalized and assets divided, she'll discover my betrayal and cut ties, keeping both her legitimate share and the hidden funds." Richard leaned back, a single tear of relief forming as pieces fell into place. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I loved her," Sandra whispered, her own tears now falling freely. "And she used that against me, just like she's using your love for her." Torres slid a folder across the table. Sworn affidavits from Sandra detailing the scheme, bank records, recordings of Aaliyah discussing the plan, enough to convince any judge of malicious intent. Richard opened the folder with steady hands, his financial analyst's eye immediately verifying the document's authenticity. Years of examining fraudulent records had honed his ability to spot genuine evidence. "She's been building a narrative that you're experiencing cognitive decline," Torres added. "Telling colleagues, friends, even your children that you've become paranoid, confused about finances." The pain of this confirmation was almost physical, but Richard channeled it into resolve. "Hence, my children's sudden concern about my mental health. It's textbook high net worth divorce strategy," Torres explained. "Isolate, discredit, extract." For the first time in days, Richard felt a spark of hope ignite. His expertise hadn't failed him. His instincts had been correct. The validation brought tears to his eyes that he no longer felt compelled to hide. "What happens now?" Sandra asked. Richard carefully returned the documents to the folder, wiping a tear from his cheek with newfound determination. "Now we use 40 years of financial forensics experience to bring truth to light." He reached for his phone, calling Patricia Winters with renewed confidence. "Patricia, I've found our smoking gun. Schedule emergency court proceedings immediately." As he ended the call, Richard noticed his hands were perfectly steady for the first time since discovering the offshore accounts. "Will this be enough?" Sandra asked, uncertainty clouding her features. Richard allowed himself a small smile, the weight on his shoulders lightening perceptibly. "Ms. Martinez, in financial fraud cases, follow the money. And thanks to you, we now know exactly where it went. Trust shattered by someone you built a life with. Comment your moment of courage when you decided to fight back. Like for strength, follow to witness Richard's day of reckoning where wisdom finally gets its due." Richard straightened his tie in the bathroom mirror, studying his reflection with critical eyes. 3 days had passed since meeting Sandra and Torres, days spent in meticulous preparation with Patricia Winters and her legal team. The man staring back at him appeared older than a week ago, but also somehow stronger. Grief had carved new lines around his eyes, but determination had straightened his spine. Today's emergency hearing would determine whether the court would freeze Aaliyah's access to their assets pending investigation. A critical first step. His phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Thinking of you today, Dad. Mom says you're forcing her to court. Please reconsider." Richard's throat tightened. Despite everything, the thought of his children witnessing this public unraveling of their parents' marriage brought fresh pain. He left the message unanswered, tucking the phone away with a silent promise to rebuild those relationships once truth prevailed. Patricia waited for him outside the courthouse, professional and focused in her charcoal suit. "Sandra and Torres are already inside, separate entrance as discussed." Aaliyah's legal team filed a counter-motion this morning. "What counter-motion?" Richard asked, climbing the courthouse steps with careful dignity. "They're requesting psychological evaluation before proceedings continue, citing concerning behavior patterns and possible cognitive decline." A bitter laugh escaped him. "Right on schedule." "Richard," Patricia's voice softened slightly, "are you prepared to see her, to maintain composure regardless of provocation?" He nodded, swallowing the emotion threatening to surface. "I spent 30 years testifying in financial fraud cases, Patricia. I know how to keep personal feelings separate from factual testimony." Inside, the courtroom's polished wood and formal atmosphere provided familiar comfort. Richard had spent much of his career in rooms like this, though never as the plaintiff in his own case. He settled into his seat beside Patricia, arranging his notes with habitual precision. A small gasp escaped him when Aaliyah entered through the side door with her legal team. Despite everything, the sight of her, elegant in a conservative navy suit, hair immaculately styled, sent a jolt of conflicted emotion through him. 43 years of loving someone didn't vanish overnight, even when replaced by betrayal. Their eyes met briefly across the room. Aaliyah's expression shifted from confident to concerned so smoothly that only someone who had studied her face for 4 decades would notice the calculation behind it. She leaned toward her lawyer, whispering something that made him nod sympathetically while glancing at Richard. The theatrical performance made Richard's jaw clench. He'd watched Aaliyah charm boards of directors and business competitors for years, admiring her skill. Now, recognizing those same techniques deployed against him brought a surprising tear to his eye, not of sadness, but of clarity. How many times had she used these same manipulations within their marriage? "All rise," called the bailiff as Judge Martha Wilson entered the courtroom. Richard stood, focusing on the calming rhythm of his breathing. He caught sight of Sandra slipping into a back row, Torres beside her. Elena and James were noticeably absent. Whether by choice or Aaliyah's design, he couldn't know. Judge Wilson's piercing gaze swept the courtroom, settling briefly on Richard before moving to Aaliyah. "I've reviewed the emergency motions from both parties. This is highly unusual, particularly given the length of the marriage in question." Richard listened as Aaliyah's attorney presented their counter-motion first, portraying a concerned wife worried about her husband's mental health, his sudden paranoid delusions about finances, his harassment of her business associates. When Patricia rose to present their evidence, Richard felt a moment of profound gratitude for his lifelong habit of meticulous record-keeping. The offshore accounts, the missing documents, the sworn testimony from Sandra and Torres, all presented in organized, indisputable sequence. A single tear escaped as Patricia concluded, "Your Honor, this is not about a marriage ending. This is about the systematic financial exploitation of my client through deliberate fraud." Judge Wilson studied the evidence files, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Lopez, these financial discrepancies require explanation." Aaliyah stood with perfect poise, her voice gentle with practiced concern. "Your Honor, there are no discrepancies. These are legitimate business accounts my husband was fully aware of until his recent confusion began." Richard felt his hand tremble slightly on the table. The audacity of the lie, delivered with such conviction, momentarily stole his breath. "Mr. Lopez," Judge Wilson turned to him. "Do you wish to respond?" Richard rose slowly, decades of courtroom experience steadying his voice despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Your Honor, I spent 40 years investigating financial fraud. These are not legitimate business accounts. They are deliberately structured to hide assets." He paused, one tear tracking down his cheek as he looked directly at Aaliyah for the first time. "And while I may be many things at 65, confused about offshore banking structures is not one of them." Judge Wilson nodded, something like recognition flickering in her eyes. "I'm ordering all joint assets frozen pending full financial review. We'll reconvene next week for complete hearings." She fixed Aaliyah with a pointed stare, "with forensic accountants present." As the gavel struck, Richard exhaled slowly, feeling both victory and sadness. Across the room, he caught Aaliyah's expression shifting from confidence to calculation, the look he'd seen countless times when she faced business setbacks, but never before directed at him. Outside in the corridor, Patricia squeezed his arm. "First round to us. Good work, Richard." He nodded, emotion making speech difficult. This small victory felt hollow without his children's support, but it was a necessary first step toward reclaiming truth. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Dad, it's James. We need to talk. Alone. Richard's heart leaped with cautious hope as he stepped into the spring sunshine, ready for whatever came next. The grand courtroom fell silent as Judge Martha Wilson entered, her experienced gaze sweeping across the now packed gallery. Word had spread about the high-profile case involving CEO Aaliyah Lopez and her husband Richard, drawing curious onlookers and business associates from both sides. Richard sat straight-backed beside Patricia, his demeanor calm despite the emotional maelstrom within. The past week had been transformative. James had met him privately, initially skeptical, but increasingly troubled as Richard methodically presented evidence. By meeting's end, his son had embraced him, tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Dad," James had whispered. She made it sound so convincing. Elena had followed suit 2 days later, her analytical mind, so like Richard's own, processing the evidence with growing horror. How could she do this to you? To us? Now, both children sat directly behind him, their presence a silent declaration of support that meant more than any court victory could. Aaliyah entered with her legal team, her confident stride faltering slightly upon seeing her children behind Richard. The flash of anger in her eyes was quickly masked by a practiced look of maternal concern. "The court calls Sandra Martinez," Judge Wilson announced once proceedings began. Sandra approached the witness stand, visibly nervous but resolute. Under Patricia's questioning, she methodically detailed her relationship with Aaliyah, the offshore accounts, and the strategy to frame Richard as mentally declining. "Mrs. Lopez told me explicitly that once the divorce was finalized, she would have both her legal share of assets and the hidden funds," Sandra testified, voice strengthening as she spoke. She said Mr. Lopez would be too discredited for anyone to believe his claims. Richard watched Aaliyah's face during this testimony, noting the subtle tightening around her eyes, her tell when business negotiations turned against her. A tell he'd pointed out years ago, helping her improve her poker face for corporate dealings. Michael Torres followed with his evidence, including recorded conversations between Sandra and Aaliyah discussing the offshore accounts. "And you verified these recordings' authenticity?" Patricia asked. "Yes, through multiple independent forensic audio analysts," Torres confirmed. The courtroom murmured as Aaliyah's attorney objected, claiming invasion of privacy. Judge Wilson overruled with a pointed glare. The turning point came when the court-appointed forensic accountant presented his findings. "The offshore structures show clear patterns of deliberate concealment," he explained, displaying charts that Richard had helped prepare. "These aren't business accounts. They're personal assets hidden through shell corporations." Judge Wilson turned to Aaliyah, whose composure showed its first significant crack. "Mrs. Lopez, would you care to explain these findings?" Aaliyah stood, smoothing her impeccable suit. "Your Honor, these accounts were established for legitimate tax planning purposes. My husband was fully aware." "That is demonstrably false," the accountant interrupted, unusual for the typically reserved expert. "Mr. Lopez's signature was forged on multiple authorization documents. The forensic analysis is conclusive." A ripple moved through the courtroom. Richard felt a single tear of vindication form as years of professional expertise were finally validated. "Furthermore," the accountant continued, "evidence suggests Mrs. Lopez has been liquidating assets and transferring funds as recently as yesterday, despite the court's freeze order." Judge Wilson's expression hardened. "Is this true, Mrs. Lopez?" Aaliyah's attorney whispered urgently in her ear, but she brushed him aside, her mask of concern transforming into cold calculation. "These are my assets," she stated flatly. "Built through my company, my career. Richard was just along for the ride." The cruel dismissal of their 43-year partnership sent a physical pain through Richard's chest, but also released something, the last lingering doubt that he might be misinterpreting her actions. "Mrs. Lopez," Judge Wilson's voice cut like steel, Your company was built during your marriage, with joint funds, joint decisions, and according to these records, significant financial guidance from your husband. Aaliyah's composure cracked further. He's turning everyone against me with these accusations. My own children. Mom! Stop! Elena's voice rang out from behind Richard. We've seen the evidence. In that moment, something shifted in Aaliyah's expression, a recognition that her carefully constructed narrative was unraveling completely. I find clear evidence of attempted fraud upon the court, Judge Wilson declared. All assets will remain frozen pending criminal investigation into financial fraud and perjury. Richard watched, emotions conflicted, as court officers approached Aaliyah to explain the severity of violating the existing asset freeze. The woman he'd loved for more than 4 decades now stood alone, her face a mask of thwarted rage, so different from the partner he thought he knew. As the proceedings concluded, Richard felt James's hand on his shoulder. You okay, Dad? I will be, he answered truthfully, wiping away the tear that had finally escaped. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, sensing the dramatic reversal in the high-profile case. Richard declined comment, walking between his children toward the future he hadn't planned but would now face with dignity. Patricia caught up with them at the car. Richard, the judge wants to see you privately in chambers. Did she say why? He asked, puzzled. Only that she has information about Aaliyah's business practices you should be aware of. Patricia smiled slightly. I think you've got an ally in Judge Wilson. Richard nodded, glancing back at the courthouse where Aaliyah remained with her increasingly concerned legal team. There was no joy in seeing her downfall, only a sad vindication that truth had prevailed. Dad, Elena said softly, let's go home. Home. The word held new meaning now. No longer the shared space of a 43-year marriage, but a place to rebuild from betrayal toward something different, something honest. As they drove away, Richard felt tears of relief finally flow freely, no longer needing to hide them from his children or himself. The worst had happened, and he had survived. More than survived. Prevailed through expertise, evidence, and the wisdom that comes only with age and experience. 6 weeks after the courthouse revelation, Richard sat on his porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of amber and rose. The rhythmic creaking of the chains brought comfort, a familiar sound in a life now transformed. The legal aftermath had been swift and comprehensive. Judge Wilson, herself a victim of financial fraud years earlier, had ensured the case received priority. Aaliyah now faced criminal charges for perjury, fraud, and violating court orders. The $150 million in offshore accounts had been recovered and frozen pending final settlement. Richard sipped his coffee, allowing himself to acknowledge the complex emotions that still surfaced daily. Grief for the partnership he'd thought they shared. Relief that his expertise had protected his family's legacy. Pride in his children's resilience. Elena's car pulled into the driveway, followed by James's SUV. Sunday dinner, a new tradition born from the ashes of betrayal. Richard set his cup aside and moved to welcome them, noting how Elena carried a folder of papers along with her usual dish for dinner. Dad, she said, embracing him warmly. We need to talk about something before dinner. Inside, they gathered around the dining table, still the same mahogany expanse where family meals had been shared for decades, now laden with different memories. What's this about? Richard asked, watching his children exchange meaningful glances. Elena opened her folder. James and I have been thinking about the settlement. The divorce proceedings were nearly complete, the division of assets clear-cut after Aaliyah's attempted fraud was documented. Richard would retain the family home, his investments, and substantial damages. Dad, you've been incredibly generous about ensuring Mom still has enough to live on despite everything, James began carefully. Richard nodded. Despite Aaliyah's actions, he couldn't bring himself to seek vengeance through financial ruin. 43 years doesn't disappear overnight, regardless of how they ended. That's just it, Elena continued. We've been thinking about legacy, yours and ours. She slid a document across the table. We want to establish the Lopez Family Foundation with part of the settlement funds. Richard adjusted his reading glasses, scanning the proposal with growing emotion. The foundation would support financial literacy for seniors and fund initiatives protecting elderly individuals from fraud and exploitation. Your expertise shouldn't end with retirement, James explained. This way, your knowledge helps others avoid similar situations. A tear slipped down Richard's cheek as he read through their thoughtful proposal. You've put considerable work into this. We have one condition, Elena added, her expression serious. You have to serve as the foundation's first chairman. Your experience is the whole point. Richard's hand trembled slightly as he traced the foundation's proposed logo, his initials incorporated into a protective shield design. After decades of building security for his family, followed by Aaliyah's betrayal, his children were offering something profound, purpose beyond pain. There's more, James said, reaching for another folder. I've been in touch with Sandra. Richard raised an eyebrow. Sandra Martinez had disappeared from public view after her testimony, declining interviews despite lucrative offers. She's moved across country, started over, James explained. But she sent this for you. Inside was a handwritten letter thanking Richard for his dignity throughout the proceedings and for not seeking retribution against her despite her role in the affair. The final paragraph brought fresh tears to his eyes. You showed me what true integrity looks like in the face of betrayal. I've enrolled in finance courses, determined to rebuild my life with honesty as the foundation. Thank you for the example you never knew you were setting. Richard carefully refolded the letter, emotion making speech difficult. Outside, twilight deepened as neighborhood children called to each other in the street, life continuing, evolving, renewing. The foundation is perfect, he finally managed, voice rough with feeling. I'd be honored. Elena squeezed his hand. We thought you might feel that way. As they moved to the kitchen to prepare dinner together, Richard paused at the mantel where family photographs chronicled decades of shared history. He'd considered removing them after the betrayal, but had ultimately decided against it. That history, however complicated now, had produced two remarkable children and shaped the man he'd become. He adjusted a frame containing a recent photo of himself with James and Elena, taken at the lake house where they'd spent a healing weekend after the trial. Their faces reflected a new bond, forged through adversity rather than broken by it. Richard rejoined his children in the kitchen, accepting the apron Elena handed him with a smile. The pasta sauce they were preparing was his mother's recipe, taught to Aaliyah years ago and now passed to Elena. Some traditions deserved preservation, regardless of their source. Later, as they enjoyed their meal, conversation flowed easily between shared memories and future plans. Richard found himself laughing genuinely for the first time in months at James's retelling of a workplace mishap. When his children eventually departed with promises to return next Sunday, Richard returned to the porch swing, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. His coffee had long since cooled, but he didn't mind. A peaceful tear tracked down his cheek, not of grief or anger or vindication, but simple gratitude. At 65, life had dealt him an unexpected blow, but also revealed unexpected strength. In the ruins of betrayal, he'd discovered not just survival, but the possibility of something new. Richard Lopez gently pushed the swing into motion, its familiar creak a counterpoint to the evening's gentle sounds. Tomorrow would bring foundation paperwork, meetings with the settlement team, perhaps even a coffee with a fellow retiree who'd called to check on him. For tonight, it was enough to sit beneath the stars, feeling the weight of betrayal gradually lifting from his shoulders, replaced by the lighter burden of new beginnings. You know that moment, don't you? When the world you thought was solid suddenly shifts beneath your feet. Perhaps it was a letter, like Richard found, or a phone call, or words spoken too casually to be anything but devastating. We've all faced betrayal in some form, that sharp intake of breath when trust shatters like fine crystal dropped on kitchen tile. Trust takes decades to build, but seconds to break. In Richard's story, perhaps you recognized something of your own journey. The silent tears falling in an empty room, the disbelief that someone who shared your morning coffee for 40 years could become a stranger by evening. Maybe you've sat in a worn chair, photographs watching from the walls, wondering how you missed the signs. It ain't easy, is it, when the life you built together turns out to be standing on quicksand? But there's something else you might have recognized too. That quiet strength that comes from weathered hands and seasoned hearts. The kind that knows how to trace inconsistencies in bank statements or hear the slight change in a loved one's voice that signals deception. The wisdom that comes only with years lived fully, both the joyful and the painful. Society may call it getting old, but we know better. It's experience becoming armor when we need it most. Richard's journey from tears to testimony reminds us that age brings not just vulnerability, but power. The same meticulous attention developed over decades of professional life becomes the very tool that saves us from those who mistake our gray hair for gullibility. The patience learned through raising children serves us when rebuilding from betrayal's ashes. The ability to distinguish between what's worth fighting for and what's better left behind, that's the gift of our years. Perhaps tonight you're sitting on your own porch swing, the familiar creak, a counterpoint to evening crickets, thinking about your own battles won and lost. Maybe there's a cooling cup of coffee beside you, or a photograph in your hands. Remember this: every tear shed in private pain waters the garden of your resilience. Every moment you chose dignity over despair adds another brick to the foundation of your legacy. The clock may tick forward relentlessly, but wisdom only deepens with each passing year. And sometimes, like Richard discovered, the most beautiful chapter of our story begins precisely when we thought the book was closing.